Well, good to see you all. It's always great to come back down and see my friends here at HCSV. I guess we're doing this thing now where I come every 6 months to comment on the Trump administration. You know, one of the disadvantages of my job, I teach at San Francisco State, is that I don't get to turn away from this stuff. Every day I got to look at this stuff. I'm almost jealous of people who can just tune out of current events, but I don't have that luxury. But, you know, like some things, if you have to do it every day, it's not quite so bad. So, but let me say at the outset how much I appreciate you all being here. The mere fact that you're here tells me that you're a citizen, not just a consumer, a citizen. Somebody who cares about public affairs and wants to keep learning and engaging about public affairs. So good for you. I think if self-government in this world is going to survive, it's only because people make it survive, you know. I think history shows that democracy or republic or some combination of the two does not automatically sustain itself. It can slip away. And so, again, I congratulate you, appreciate you for being here. So my topic, as in past January, is Trump and the Constitution, and my comments today are divided into two parts. First, I want to say something about Trump's impact on the balance of power at 5 levels of government and politics. Second, I want to discuss some of the structural and process changes to our constitutional order that we might pursue in order to remedy some of the imbalances I've indicated and maybe minimize the chances of another Trump. And again, just as important, since I consider this more of a dialogue among citizens than just a lecture, I look forward to your questions and comments. Now, at the outset, to lay my cards on the table, I've never thought that Donald Trump is qualified to be president. This is probably not surprising to you. I'm a political science professor and I take politics seriously. In fact, I find 2 analogies for Trump in James Comey's recently published book, A Higher Loyalty, to be quite telling and insightful. First, having prosecuted organized crime figures early in his career in the Justice Department, Comey writes that his interactions with Trump and those around him reminded him of a crime family in which loyalty and secrecy, not values of constitutional democracy, prevail. Second, he describes Trump as a forest fire. I find that a strikingly accurate image for Trump's impact on our constitutional order. Now, there's no way to predict what will happen. The only certainty is that eventually he will not be president. Thank you, 22nd Amendment. In any case, once again, I want to say something about his impact on our constitutional order and some of the changes we might make to perfect our union, to improve our constitutional order going forward. So in this world, there are centers of power, like religious, economic, and political power. As we know, however, power corrupts, and it poses dangers. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison wrote that power is of an encroaching nature. And I think what he means by that is that power is not static. It's dynamic. It moves. It changes. And where it tends to move is into fewer and fewer hands. I think that was his point. So this is important. And for centuries, as a result, humans have pondered, how do we check power? How do we limit power? By dispersing it and balancing it against other centers of power. So again, I want to distinguish 5 levels of government and politics at which power must be balanced. And then I want to try to say something about Trump's implications for each one. So let me give you the 5 categories, and then I'll go over them one by one. I'm going to say that going from broadest to narrowest, number 1, power needs to be balanced among nations. So in the international realm, international relations. Secondly, within one particular nation like the United States, power needs to be balanced among centers of power like political, economic, and religious power. And I'm going to bring in the press in a little bit as well. More narrowly, within politics, within political centers of power, there needs to be a balance Testing. Wow. Want to adjust it? Is it okay now?
You get electrocuted?
No. That's right. You don't want to electrocute a lawyer. All right. All right. Okay, there we go. All right, we're back.
It's loud.
Okay, here we go.
It's too loud.
Now it's too loud, they say.
It's always going to sound too loud.
This is tough. Yeah, all right. Yeah, okay, all right. All right, I need to play the odds here. I need to make sure most people can hear me. So, and if it's too loud, maybe move back. You'll be able to hear me. Okay, we good? We all right? Okay. So once again, I'm going to say there are 5 different levels of power at which there needs to be a balance, a separation and a balance of power. Again, too much power in too few hands is always trouble. None of us can be trusted. None of us. So, among nations, first of all, there needs to be a balance of power. Secondly, within nations, among great centers of power like the political, the economic, the religious, and press. Within political centers of power, just within government, between different levels of government. And there, we're talking about a structural feature of American constitutionalism called federalism. Federalism is that division of power, authority, responsibility between the national and state levels of government. More narrowly, within the same level of government, there needs to be a balance of power between different branches of government, the legislative, the executive, the judicial. And that's often referred to as separation of powers. And then finally, most narrowly, within a single branch of government, there needs to be, again, a balance between different centers of power. So, for example, in the Congress, there's a balance of power between the House and the Senate. They have to divide and share power. On the federal courts, there's a division of power between trial courts and appellate courts. And with the executive department, which is our focus today, there has historically been a separation of power between the White House and the Justice Department, and the FBI, which is part of the Justice Department. So I'll take these 5 one at a time, and I'll have more to say on some than others, and hopefully that'll lead to a good discussion. So number 1, as for the balance of power among nations, it looks to me like the U.S. may be losing influence in the world under Trump. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about this since I have no expertise in international relations, but it seems to me that from withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord to the Iranian deal to recent tariffs, Trump is alienating many allies who are now looking for global leadership elsewhere. So that's one place where Trump has had an impact. Now, the next 3 levels, numbers 2, 3, and 4, are actually expressly referenced in the Constitution itself. So that second level, within our nation, there needs to be a balance among political, economic, religious, and the press centers of power. The First Amendment, of course, does pretty well in separating politics from both religion and the press. Right? The First Amendment provides, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And it's interesting, that word "the" makes a difference. The freedom of speech or of the press. They were referring to an existing freedom of speech. Now, in the 1780s, the law of free speech was not nearly as developed and nuanced as it is now. Nonetheless, the First Amendment speaks to these and separates these basic centers of power. Politics versus religion, politics versus the press. Now, as for balancing economic and political power, that's not really spoken to directly in the Constitution, but here, of course, we come to the infamous Citizens United versus FEC decision of 2010 by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the prospect of amending the Constitution to invalidate that ruling and authorize Congress and the states to enact comprehensive campaign finance reform. This problem of balancing economic and political power
Yeah, let me record if you don't talk.
Okay, all right. Let me just try. Can y'all hear me? I can speak. I've had to learn how to do that.
You have to speak in the mic.
Have to speak in the mic. All right. Going? Yeah, there you go. Test. All right. Okay. Where am I here? Yeah. All right. So this problem of balancing economic and political power, keeping them separate and balanced against each other, is arguably one of the factors in Trump's election, along with the outdated electoral college, Russian hacking into our social media and so forth. And again, I'll return to a consideration of Citizens United in the second part. So the third level, narrowing down to within the domain of politics, right? There needs to be a balance of power between the national and state levels of government, federalism, right? Expressly provided for in the Constitution. Now here, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say at the end. It seems to me that, at least in some ways, there might be some good news. You know, the states, it looks to me, are pushing back against Trump in some ways. Let's see, on the Muslim ban, on climate change, they're pushing back. In addition to that, you know, the Democrats might do well in federal and state races in November. We'll have to see about that. That might be a way in which states can empower themselves, embolden themselves against Trump's national government. In California, Jerry Brown defied Trump openly. And Gavin Newsom is now running on his opposition to Trump. So the states are pushing back. So the fourth level, within the political domain, within politics, and within the same level of government, like I say, there must be a balance of power, as the Constitution tries to provide, between different branches of government: the legislative, which makes the laws; the executive, which enforces the laws; and the courts, the judiciary, which interprets and applies the laws. There has to be a balance of power among those centers of power within the government. Now, so here we see, for example, the Republican Congress largely enabling and even cowering before Trump, rather than checking him. So that's a concern. So if the Democrats don't blow it in November, the ultimate political power, the voters, might elect a Democratic House and Senate, and those bodies would presumably do more than the present Congress to put checks on Trump. A Democratic House might even impeach Trump, but remember, removal by the Senate would probably be a long shot. I can come back and speak to that. Now, as for the federal courts, first thing to mention, of course, is this guy Neil Gorsuch. He is Trump's one nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court. And, yeah, this guy is, let's say he's not a real big civil libertarian. I would go so far as to say that if Trump gets another nominee on the U.S. Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade is gone. It's gone. Now, at the same time, that's news at that level. In some ways, federal courts are pushing back. Again, as in the Muslim ban, 2 lower courts invalidated the Muslim ban. We'll see what the U.S. Supreme Court later this month is going to do with that. But we'll see what happens. So then, finally, we come to the fifth and final level where power must be balanced, and that is within the same branch of government. And specifically here, I'm thinking about the executive branch of the national government. And there, as I mentioned, there's been a long tradition of separating law enforcement, you know, the Department of Justice and the FBI, from the political sphere, the White House. And, you know, with that separation, you know, you never would have thought that a president would pull an FBI director aside to say, I hope you can let this thing with Michael Flynn go, you know. So, again, Trump is putting some stress on this balance. Now, on this topic, you know, of power separation, checks of power within the same branch, within the executive branch of government, at this point, the 25th Amendment to the Constitution could be relevant. Under the 25th Amendment, the Vice President and the Cabinet are empowered to force Congress to vote whether to remove the President by a 2/3 vote in both houses. I have to say that at this point that does not seem promising. It's interesting. It's long seemed to me that if some of the major, most respected members of Trump's cabinet, like, well, Tillerson, he's gone now, maybe Pompeo, but Mattis, Secretary of Defense, some of these other folks, maybe Mnuchin, some of these other folks who are really the more credible people, if they got together and they decided, that's it, this guy is unfit to serve, I think the 25th Amendment might kick into effect. But I see no sign of that now, so we just got to let that go. So that all is as far as I got last night in my presentation at the dinner. So let me move on at this point. Now that we're talking about, you know, we're down to the level of what's going on within the executive branch, of course, now we come to the Mueller investigation. And several questions arise there. The first question, it seems to me, is Mueller safe or is he removable by Trump? Yeah, it's an open question, and I think that whether Trump will try to remove Mueller, either directly or indirectly through Rod Rosenstein, the Assistant Attorney General, may be more a function of politics than law. Seems to me, if Mueller comes out with this report and it's damning, you know, millions of people will be in the streets, and not just in this country. So I'll circle back to that. Just keep in mind, though, that even if Mueller is removed, that's not the end of Donald Trump's legal problems, because the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York is now involved in the Michael Cohen strand of all this, Trump's legal risks. And so just because Mueller is gone doesn't mean Trump's legal problems are gone as well. So keep an eye on that. Anyway, next, assuming that Mueller is safe and will not be removed, putting that aside, can the president use the pardon power as he has been using it? You know, if you look back, presidents like Clinton and Obama used the pardon power at the very end of their term, just as they were leaving office, right? Because they were, using it to do some controversial things. Trump, as you'll notice, is not doing that. And since I teach courses on the Federalist Papers, I looked this up. It wasn't hard to find that Alexander Hamilton actually spoke to the pardon power back in 1788. Let me read you part of what Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist number 74 with respect to the pardon power, and it'll give us a way to think about, the propriety with which Trump is using the pardon power. Hamilton writes, "Humanity and good policy dictate that the benign prerogative of pardoning should be as little as possible fettered or embarrassed. The criminal code of every country partakes so much of necessary severity that without easy access to exceptions in favor of unfortunate guilt, justice would wear a countenance too sanguinary and cruel." Don't you love it when people write like that? Huh? How about that? This guy was a genius. He goes on. He says, "But the principal argument for the president's pardon power is this. In seasons of insurrection or rebellion, there are often critical moments when a well-timed offer of pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth, and which, if suffered to pass unimproved, it may never be possible afterwards to recall." End quote. So you look at that, and then you think about how Trump is using the pardon power. You be the judge, Does that sound like Trump is using this power the way that the founders conceived it? Doesn't look like it. Trump, of course, is using pardons of people like Joe Arpaio and Dinesh D'Souza to send a message to people like Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort that if they hang tough and they don't cooperate with Mueller, Trump will take care of them. Put yourself in Cohen or Manafort's spot. Would you trust Trump? Yeah. And especially now that Manafort has been accused, and I think the other day indicted, for witness tampering. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but I think the argument can be made that just the way that Trump has used the pardon power alone constitutes obstruction of justice. Anyway, the next issue. If Mueller issues a subpoena, that's a great word, subpoena. Sub, under, pena, penalty. Under penalty, you must show up and testify, right? So if Mueller issues a subpoena for Trump to testify before a grand jury, must Trump comply? It's interesting. You may know that in a letter to Mueller, Trump's lawyers argue that Trump is too busy. Folks, that was a joke.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to point that out. I mean, it writes itself, this stuff, right? Trump is too busy? Yeah, he'd have to take time out of watching Fox News for hours every morning, and as well as being on the golf course, right? So that one seems to ring a little hollow. Anyway, that said, though, I want to be clear that the claim that the president thinks he's above the law is oversimplified. In U.S. versus Nixon, 1974, the ruling after which Nixon resigned within a week, U.S. v. Nixon recognized that the president is not identically situated to other citizens in all respects. If the U.S. were suddenly at war, for example, the commander-in-chief's time cannot be absorbed in a lawsuit. That's U.S. v. Nixon that made that point. But that said, in the 1990s, Clinton v. Jones held that the president had to comply with the grand jury subpoena to be deposed in a lawsuit for sexual harassment. Two things about that, however. The first is that that lawsuit was based on Clinton's conduct before he was president, unlike in the case of Trump. Secondly, the Paula Jones lawsuit was a civil suit in which the court could have just stopped the statute of limitations until the president was out of office, thus protecting the country without unduly burdening the plaintiff, Mrs. Jones. Ms. Jones, she'll have her day in court, she's just got to wait a little bit. That said, by contrast to the Jones case, I would think that in a federal criminal matter, like the Mueller investigation, the urgent, compelling need for the president to comply, the need for, quote, every man's evidence, as the court noted in Nixon, would prevail. So we'll see. In any case, whatever the fate of a subpoena, this brings us to the next issue. If Mueller concludes that there is sufficient evidence to indict Trump, indict him for crimes like obstruction of justice, what then? What happens then? Well, the first thing to note is that a long-standing internal Department of Justice rule bars indictment of a sitting president. Although I understand that exceptions can be made around the edges, we'll see how that plays out. So again, what if Mueller concludes that there are grounds for indictment? What then? Well, Mueller would be bound first to submit a report to Rosenstein, the acting Attorney General. Assuming at least the conclusions of this report would be leaked to the press, and I think that they would be, there will be pressure on Rosenstein to turn the report over to Congress. After all, it is Congress that has the ultimate authority. Congress can remove the president and doesn't even have to write out a judicial opinion justifying it, right? So this may be where the ultimate center of power, the voters, come in. Let us assume that the Democrats win both the House and the Senate in November. Let's also assume that Mueller concludes that Trump is indictable and he files a report with Rosenstein, who turns it over to Congress. I would think that a democratically controlled House would impeach, but even under the best case scenario, the Democrats will not have the two-thirds majority in the Senate that might be required to guarantee removal. Now again, by this time, I would think millions of us would be in the streets to protest Trump, to command his ouster. And this would be all over the world, by the way. I submit people would be in the streets all over the world if it comes to this, protesting against Trump. The pressure would be on some of these Republican senators to support removal. Also by this time, however, I think that Trump, the ultimate distractor, would start a war. And that in turn would give some Republican senators political cover to say, hey, we can't remove a commander-in-chief in time of war. So, anyway, assuming then that the Senate would not remove Trump, just in passing, it seems to me that there are two other possibilities here. One is that by a simple majority vote in both houses, Congress could probably formally censure the president. Although as soon as we think about that in terms of Trump, right, I mean, what effect would that have on somebody like Trump? He would proudly announce it in his tweets, you know, to rile up his base. And so I'm not sure how far that would go. The other thing, though, that's a possibility, again, the Democrats take control at least of the House in November and Trump starts a war to distract us. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress controls the money. Appropriations. And so the democratically controlled House could deny funds for Trump's war. But then you can already figure out what would happen then, right? Trump would immediately take to Twitter and tweet that the congressional Democrats do not support our heroes in uniform. So this is all speculative. I mean, I don't want to, you know, who knows what's going to happen. The only predictable thing about Trump I've found is that he's unpredictable. So this depends on a lot of things that we cannot know. This, however, I know. After 2024, maybe after 2020, maybe even before 2020, Trump will no longer be president. So let's move to the second part of my talk. I want to speak to what we might do going forward to improve our constitutional order, to, as Barack Obama said more than once, to form a more perfect union. Specifically, I'd like to speak to some of the structural and process-based adjustments we might make in order to again, improve our constitutional politics and also maybe minimize the chances that another guy like Trump would get elected. The first thing, which I referenced before, has to do with the Citizens United opinion and the readjustment of the balance between economic and political power. In Citizens United, 2010 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, the Supreme Court held that two provisions of federal law were unconstitutional. These provisions of federal law forbade spending from the general treasury funds of corporations and unions in political campaigns. And the U.S. Supreme Court struck that down. And I want to be clear, I can talk about this later. Things like money is speech and corporations are persons go back far longer than Citizens United. Those are simply pillars on which Citizens United rested. So, now I've read both the majority and the dissenting opinions in Citizens United. The dissent is 90 pages long by Justice John Paul Stevens, who is now retired. And they are both very powerful, lucid legal arguments on both sides. This is not a slam dunk legally. However, as a matter of politics, put aside law, as a matter of politics, raw political preference, if we the people decide that we want to reestablish a balance between economic and political power, we can amend the U.S. Constitution along the lines, I think the best way, the best wording would be that suggested by Justice John Paul Stevens in a book he published about 5 years ago. It would say something like this. The amendment would provide, nothing in the First Amendment shall prevent Congress or the states from enacting comprehensive campaign finance reform. Nothing in the First Amendment, so that wipes out the power of Citizens United. Nothing in the First Amendment shall prevent Congress or the states from enacting comprehensive campaign finance reform. And you should know that we're already most of the way toward forcing Congress to call a convention to propose such an amendment. Under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, there's two ways to propose an amendment. One is by 2/3 of both houses of Congress voting for it. Now, you already know that's not going to happen. Congress can barely tie its shoes at this point, right? So to get 2/3 of them to get, even though it's in their interest, nonetheless, the other way in which a proposal to the Constitution can be made, if 2/3 of state legislatures call on Congress to call a convention to propose an amendment, Congress shall do so. It has no choice. So you understand the states can force Congress to call that convention to propose an amendment. Now that proposal would still have to go before the states and be approved by 3/4 of states. Now, that's a pretty high bar, but the point is we're further along than you might have thought. Did you notice when you and I voted in the election in 2016, one of the ballot proposals was precisely to direct the California state legislature to call on Congress to call a convention to propose an amendment. So we are most of the way there. Nationally, we are most of the way there. It takes 2/3 of state legislatures to do this. That's 34 state legislatures. We are somewhere in the 20s at this point. So I just wanted you to know that. That is going on. And that may be the way that we have to do this. People have suggested, well, Congress can just pass a law to take care of this. But again, that's not quite so simple. So, and if Congress and the states stepped up to use the power that this amendment would give them, they could use a combination of tools to deal with the impact of money on politics, like public funding, like full disclosure of all contributions, like matching funds from the government. So that's one thing that's out there. A second thing that I'm sure has occurred to a lot of you that we might do going forward to have our politics work better would be electoral college reform of the electoral college, especially given the results in both the year 2000 and 2016. Some of us are old enough to remember the year 2000 when Al Gore won the popular vote by 250,000 votes, and yet he was not president because of the way that the Electoral College works. By contrast, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by 12 times that much, right? Nearly 3 million votes. So that's a broken system. And I'm not saying that, majority rule must in all cases be what determines, outcomes, but, I think a lot of people would agree that, either abolishing the Electoral College or letting it work the way that it was originally supposed to would be the best way to go. Right now, my understanding is that electors are required when they go to the convention to vote as a majority of the voters in their state voted. So they don't go there to deliberate like a Republican institution, Republican in the original sense of, deliberative and so forth. So, again, my vote would be either to get rid of the Electoral College or let it function the way it was originally supposed to. The way that it's going now is not serving us. Okay, a third one, change that is starting to take place, but at the rate that it's going, it's going to take a long time. U.S. House districts. So districts for the U.S. House of Representatives could be drawn not by state legislatures, but by independent commissions. And we do that in California. Arizona won a lawsuit in the U.S. Supreme Court to this effect that enabled, that upheld Arizona citizens voting by state ballot initiative to ensure that an independent commission draws their House districts. Because you know what's going on now. Most House districts are non-competitive. It's a lock for one party or the other, and that doesn't serve us. So again, this is one direction we might move, right? Having, letting independent commissions draw these House district lines so that these districts are competitive and not just a lock for one party or the other. Along these lines, one of my favorite pundits, David Brooks of the New York Times, who gets pounded by his readers, and that's fine, he goes with the territory, although half the time they don't understand what he's talking about, I have to say. They just fly off. But anyway, just in the last week or so, he advocated drawing larger House districts, larger geographical districts for the House of Representatives, but having them each be multi-member districts, with candidates competing in a scheme of ranked choice voting. Something like that could lead to a more accurate and effective representation in Congress. And by the way, he argues anyway, and I have no basis to dispute him, this could all be done at the level of the state, by state ballot initiatives. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that would prevent that kind of shift. And so keep an eye on that. I don't know. You may be hearing this and thinking, I don't know. The problems that beset us, they're not going to be fixed by a few structural adjustments. But I don't know. I think it's still important to think about these things. So let me just conclude by reference to the upcoming November election. It seems to me that there are two questions, at least two questions, that the Democrats going forward have to figure out how they're going to answer. The first one, and this is with respect to the presidential election in 2020. Should the Democrats go with the old guard or with younger blood? Now, you know who the old guard are, right? Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden. And the youngest among them is Elizabeth Warren, and she's pushing 70 at this point, although Biden and Sanders are going to be pushing 80 by 2019 and 2020. Now that I'm up in my late 20s, I'm less inclined to... yes, that was humor. I'm less inclined to write people off just because they're a couple years older than me. My thought is that if Bernie runs in 2020 and he's lucid and he looks like he's up to the job, I don't see why we shouldn't vote for him. Same thing with Biden. And Warren, I kind of hope she runs. She is, the first time I ever heard Elizabeth Warren talk, I thought, wow, a lot of people would get out and pound the pavement for her, She's whip smart, Harvard law professor, whatever your politics, you've got to be kind of smart to get that. And she's got this every woman quality about her, doesn't she? I think she could use a little coaching from a guy like Bill Clinton, She still tends to come off a little bit like a Harvard law professor / school marm. And that's not going to play in the red states or even some of the purple states, but it'll be interesting to see. I think if she decides to run, boy, there'd be a lot of support for her. Among the younger guard, who are we talking about? One guy that comes to mind, of course, is Cory Booker. I think he's a U.S. Senator from New Jersey, very impressive guy, and I believe he's in his second term in the Senate. So that's, that gives him enough, prominence and stature that he might be a candidate if he wants it. As Californians, of course, we often hear about Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris as possible presidential candidates. I personally think that 2020 would be too early for both of them. Newsom, assuming he wins in November, is going to be just a year into his governorship, and he's going to run for president. And Harris, whom I admire, but she's only in her first term as a U.S. Senator. I'm thinking that if running for president is in her future, probably 2024, after she's been elected a second time to the U.S. Senate, might be a better time for her. Either way, imagine the following. imagine this. Imagine whoever the Democrat is who wins in 2020, who knows, we might have an Attorney General or a Secretary of State at that point by the name of Barack Obama. Just because he was president doesn't mean he can't serve as a member of the cabinet. And wouldn't that be interesting? Think about the degree to which a guy like Obama could restore integrity to the Justice Department. Think of the respect that we would be able to earn back internationally if Barack Obama were our Secretary of State. So I'm just trying to, I try to be an optimist, and so that would be an interesting thing to see. And by the way, if you're feeling badly, as so many people are, about the Trump years, please don't forget, in the last 10 years, Americans twice elected Barack Obama president. So we got that in us as well. Yes, we have in us a strain that, along with a number of factors, led to Donald Trump being president, but in the past 10 years, we twice elected Barack Obama president. So we still got that in us as well. So that's the first thing. First question for the Democrats going forward in 2018 and 2020 is, should they go with the old guard or the new guard? Secondly, it seems to me that the Democrats are going to have to decide, I don't know if they will, but they're going to have to decide whether to primarily appeal to class-based interest or to race and gender identity politics. Steve Bannon, you all know who he is. He's exiled from the White House now, but he's still out there talking, and he said for a long time that when the Democrats embrace identity politics, the Republicans win. So I just offer that to you as a possibility. It may be that the Democrats do not fully appreciate the degree to which and how many people they alienate when they embrace race and gender identity politics. My own view is that strategically it would be safer for them to do what I think Bernie Sanders always does, is emphasize class-based, economic class-based interests, so that you're for the working class, for the middle class, without singling out particular races or a gender or ethnicity that you're in favor of. I just offer that to you to think about, folks. I could be wrong about this, but it seems to me that an awful lot of people who might otherwise be inclined to vote Democratic are very put off when somebody tells them, I'm particularly for helping people who don't look like you. It's a tough issue. So if you have comments on that, I'll be interested to hear about that. Thank you. On the other hand, this is the last thing I'll say. If they play their cards right, this could be the dawn of the golden age of white women in power. Think about this. Women right now, when we're seeing who are the faces of the administration we're seeing these days on the television? Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani, right? I don't know. I think there's probably a lot of people who would rather see some different faces up there, right? And I personally don't think women are any more intelligent or virtuous than men, or any less so. But if it were the case that there were a whole slew of women coming into Congress and they were able to start making some things happen that we need to happen, that would be perfectly fine with me. Now, I say white women, and I say that because, and again, I'm just thinking strategically here, all the people out there, in red states especially, who would never vote for a Democrat, and they might not be inclined to vote for a woman, but they might. If they see a white woman, certainly they're not going to have any problem with her race. And they might also see somebody who looks and sounds like their sister or their wife or their mother. And so I'm thinking that in terms of Democrats getting majority control of at least one house, it may well be that white women are best positioned to do this. I'm kind of going out on a limb saying that, I suppose, but this is why they give people tenure. Right? To lose my job, I'd literally have to commit a crime, and I have no plans to commit any crime, so I'm pretty much allowed to say what I think I need to say. And I think that those of us who are citizens need to be resourceful about this and just scope out all the options. And so, anyway, those are my random collective thoughts. I appreciate you listening, and I'm glad to take any questions that you've got. Okay, so I'm going to let somebody else direct traffic here, or shall I do this?
Whoever has the mic.
Whoever has the mic. Okay, so Alfred, if you would take care of that, giving the mic to people, I
Why
appreciate
when I
it.
reside in California do all my taxes still go to Massachusetts?
Hold on.
Can you wait? Wrong way? Oh, jeez, I'm not awake yet. Hi, yeah, very interesting. I had a couple of questions. The first was, you were talking more or less about the two-party system that we have right now, and I hope you've given some thought to the fact that, like, maybe the two-party system is not the optimal kind of structure for us. And then the second one I want to say something about is the white women theory, which is, I think you're wrong. I think a woman of any kind of color would do better than a white woman, because we have a lot more people in our country now from other places, and I just sort of think that that might be an advantage.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm hesitant to make generalizations based on race or gender. I really am. So I guess we'd have to have that conversation a lot longer. And we're talking about effectiveness and being able to be elected. I suspect that there are a lot of red states and red districts in which, other things equal, a white woman would have a better chance than a minority woman. That's just my sense of it, right? And again, I don't care if they're purple when they get to the House and the Senate. If they can start taking care of the country's business, which I think we're not taking care of right now because we're so distracted with the latest tweet from Trump, you know. I don't care who they look like once they get there. That's my thought. So, okay, let's move it along. It looks to me like there are a lot of folks who have questions and comments. I appreciate that. So let me try to get to as many as I can. Yes, sir. What do you say?
Yeah. Well, I disagree in that. Color doesn't matter, so I'm going to disagree with both of you about white or non-white. But if we're going to mess with the Constitution, you know, why not? I was thinking about the idea of eliminating electing the president at all and doing something radical like hiring a president the way cities hire a city manager who runs the city. Now,
not going to happen.
I know it's not going to happen, but I'm just talking about ideas that I think would work, you know. So I'll give it to you that it's not going to happen. But if you had the way you would hire a president is that you would have a contest among human resource people, and you would, you know, the winners of the contest of, you know, the people who have hired more than 10,000 people would then get together and hire a president based on looking at resumes and qualifications, and then the Congress could, you know, override it and fire the president, which would cause them to have to hire a different president. I just want to throw that out.
That's interesting. Okay.
As a really out-of-the-box idea.
It is.
Of a way, and that way you don't have two absolutely incompetent candidates like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump competing with each other. Okay. You know. All right.
Appreciate it. Thank you. I want to keep it moving, folks. If you have a question or comment, we'll get to everybody. I will stay till midnight if I have to. Right? 12:30. Oh, 12:30. All right. Yes, sir. What do you say?
Two things. Your comment about white women.
Well, that's going a long way, isn't it? Right.
Yeah. Well,
Just
you know, you talked about not dealing with identity politics, and then you start talking in that realm. To me, it implies that you think most people or many people are racist. And I think the election of Barack Obama shows you that the deplorable so-called are not racist. On the
you think racism has vanished in this country?
Of course not. But and you know that's a ridiculous retort. Of course not. The Electoral College. You talk about power balancing. Now you've obviously teach and study the Federalist Papers and the founding, and our country is based on the tension of power elites coming from different places and competing, and the system was set up to make that happen until everybody was on the same page. The Electoral College, in that regard, was designed so that the majority states could not run rampant over the will of the smaller states in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next. Next question. There's a couple of folks up here. We'll get to you all. Yes, sir. What do you say?
Yeah, a couple of comments. One is you were talking about Citizens United, and I know that there's various organizations around the country that are currently fighting against money in politics, but there's only one organization that I know of that is fighting the idea that corporations are people, and that's Move to Amend. The other thing is, you briefly mentioned ranked choice voting. I've learned a fair amount about it. I really support ranked choice voting. I think we'd get a much better result from that, in spite of what some of the people are saying in the media these days. And I guess that's it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. You know, I want to speak to something very important. Corporations as persons under the 14th Amendment. Yeah, that's the important thing there is that in the early 1880s, the U.S. Supreme Court, without explanation, simply held that corporations are persons under the 14th Amendment. That's important to understand. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment is one of the most important passages in all of American law. It provides that no state shall deny any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So no state shall deny any person. You would think that refers to human beings, but the court held early on that also includes corporations. My own thought is that if we're going to deal effectively with money in politics, I think we should leave aside corporate personhood under the 14th Amendment and just focus on the First Amendment issue, free speech. I think that if we try in one amendment to wipe out not only corporate ability to spend under the First Amendment the way that it does, but also corporations as persons, we might be biting off more than we can chew. Remember, this amendment has to get past 3/4 of the states in order to become law. And I'm no corporate lawyer. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a corporate lawyer. And so I know that corporations need to be legal entities for some purposes. For example, to sue or to be sued. That doesn't mean that they need to be persons for constitutional purposes. So I'm with you to a great degree. I just think that it's a strategic matter. It would be better just to focus on, to put aside the corporate personhood and just focus on the free speech dimension of it. Again, that's why the amendment that Justice Stevens suggests, nothing in the First Amendment shall prevent Congress and the states from enacting comprehensive campaign finance reform, I think would be the better way to go, although I certainly share your concern. The last thing I'll say is that corporations come in many shapes and sizes. They're not all just big and evil and so forth, right? They're nonprofit. There are, they're a corporation for public broadcasting. Corporations come in many shapes and sizes. A corporation is just a way of doing business. And so again, the massive amounts of economic power that corporations have is a problem. My thought is that at least initially, for the near term, the next couple of decades, we should just focus on the free speech, the First Amendment aspect of it. Thank you for your comment. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to that. Somebody else? I think there were some folks right here. Yes, sir.
Yes, I think this state legislation would go and force the amendment. Okay, I enjoy that, but how do we get around Sagamo that the Supreme Court would, disallow it? So we're playing the Sagamo. Now, what happened?
Sagamo. What is that? Sagamo.
That means when you pound one mole down in a hole, another one.
Oh,
yeah.
Whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole. Okay. I've heard it's also Sakamo. Okay. Anyway, whack-a-mole. Now, just one comment is that they avoided whack-a-mole in the French Revolution. We don't want to go there. So how do we avoid this back and forth?
Yeah, very good. Thank you, sir. Here's the thing. If we, the people, amend the Constitution, the Supreme Court has no power to invalidate that amendment. That is the law. They can't strike it down. They have to apply it and abide by it. Yeah, so good. That's why I'm thinking that, mere legislation, right? This would support your point. If Congress simply passed laws, as it has tried to do, right? McCain-Feingold and so forth, all along these lines, and if it's mere legislation, the U.S. Supreme Court can strike it down as invalid if it's unconstitutional. But if we amend the Constitution to say nothing in the First Amendment shall prevent Congress, et cetera, et cetera.
That's what trumps it then.
I'm just saying that the U.S. Supreme Court cannot invalidate that.
That means that the the amendment is Trump's legislation on a law.
An amendment is not legislation. Anyway, like I said, before I go on, I appreciate your comment very much. I appreciate your interest. If we, the people, amend the Constitution, the U.S. Supreme Court cannot invalidate that amendment unless it flatly contradicts some other amendment, which this one would not. The Supreme Court cannot strike down an amendment. It must work within the amendment because that amendment is law.
That's tricky then.
Yeah. But that is one problem that gets solved there. So, but I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Who's that? Yes, sir. What do you say?
You haven't mentioned a practical solution. That's assassination.
Duly noted. I try to. Yeah, I'm a nonviolent person. It would be okay with me that if Trump died in his sleep, it would be okay.
Don't pass this on to the CIA.
All right. Yes, sir. What do you say?
My observation of American politics is Trump's popularity is the bully pulpit, and we're noticing that some of the democracies around the world are changing to leaders given full-time life sentences as their leader.
Yes.
And somehow I'm not sure if Trump is all that unpopular because people like bullies in the pulpit.
Yeah. Hey, Plato 2,500 years ago said democracy is the worst possible form of constitution except for tyranny. Right? I think I mentioned this last night, right? Why would we give the common people political power? Most of us are not paying attention. Most of us don't know much about politics, right? Now, the last 2,500 years of Western political theory have largely been a reaction against Plato in favor of liberal democracy, but I think we can all agree at this point, liberal democracy is under threat. So, yeah. When the people get crazy and flustered, they do crazy things like throw up a strong man. And then we got to try to recover from that. So, thank you. Yes, ma'am, you were next.
Hi. So I just wanted to know your opinion. So what aspect of the Trump presidency do you find most alarming or troubling? And what can the Democrats do to, really oppose Trump? What tangible point can we really hammer into people's brains that this is not okay?
Okay. Wonderful question. Thank you. Boy, that's a tough one. I don't like the way that Trump has appealed to the worst in us. I don't like the way in which he has just debased the presidency. I mean, people will say that Bill Clinton, with what he did, that was pretty bad. But Trump is he's just lowering the level so badly, I think it's going to take a long time to recover from. The fact that he lies so easily, lie upon lie, I mean, that's a problem. I'll just give you one example here where, as immunized as I am at this point to the stuff that Trump does, it was like 3-4 months ago, and I was just yelling at my television. You might remember this. He was a ceremony where he had some Native American elders to the White House, and it was to celebrate some important day in the Native American community. And in the middle of kind of faking his way through some, honorific statements, he said, "Oh, by the way, there's a senator," and he was referring to Elizabeth Warren. "They call her Pocahontas." Let's break that down, right? It's no they, right? It's no they. It's him who is using that disrespectful, practically racist reference, and he just comes out of him. They call her Pocahontas. No, nobody else does that except you. So, that's just one example of what we're talking about. So, I don't like the way that he just is bringing down the tone so far. And it's just what an amazing contrast to a guy like Barack Obama, who in my judgment was just a class act all the way. I think that, I don't want to get off on all that. Trump, I think, feels very insecure and inadequate around a guy like Barack Obama. So I don't like the fact that it's going to take us years, if not decades, to recover from what he's doing to us. But I do hope that in the long run we're able to come out of it and come back even better than before. For my money, nobody in American history used words like Lincoln. Nobody used words like Lincoln. And I think of words like a new birth of freedom, if we can get past this. And, Lincoln led us through a pretty rough time in our history, the Civil War. So I just hope we can recover from all that. It's a great question. Did you want to follow up? Go ahead.
Yeah. And then, so with the upcoming elections, a tangible point should the Democrats really hammer down?
Good. one thing I indicated before is I think they're safer if they focus on class-based issues rather than race and gender and ethnicity. I think that's always very tempting for them. I think it's tempting for them because they think that in some ways, which is no doubt true, that will increase turnout among some communities, you know. But my own view is that the Democrats and the left do not adequately consider or recognize the degree to which they alienate people who might otherwise support the Democrats when they make those race and ethnicity and gender-based references. So that's my thought. I think they should focus on class-based issues, the way that I think Bernie Sanders has always done. When Bernie Sanders ran for president in 2016, I read every word of his platform, and he did not do this. He emphasized the more class-based, the working class and middle class issues. And even when he referenced, say, gender, right, he would say something like equal pay for equal work. Well, of course. Who can dispute that? That's a nice, safe way of putting it. It's not really buying in a heavy way to the race and gender identity politics that a lot of people on the left do, and which, again, right there, I think of what Steve Bannon said. When the left does that, the Republicans win. Now, I don't think that will be able to go on forever, but it may still be a problem in the next 2, 3, 4 elections. And so, yeah, thank you for that very provocative question. I appreciate that. It would take me a lot longer to give a full answer to the first part of it, but it's a good question. Thank you.
Testing.
Yes, who is next, please?
testing.
Yes, ma'am. What do you say? Please.
Yeah, let's see.
Go ahead, I can hear you. I can hear you.
One of the many worrisome things about Trump is understand he's been recently trying to stack the federal courts with his choice of judges, which is pretty scary. A day before Trump announced his choice for Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, he said, "Oh, you Christian fundamentalists, you're going to be so happy with my choice. Have I got a treat for you?" Which is totally contrary to what Article 6 of the Constitution says, which is there shall be no religious requirement or no religious test as a qualification for office, for the office under the United States and public trust. So he's going to stack the courts with people that...
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a fair concern. Although I don't think, this is all in the realm of politics. There's no legal remedy, right? If, let's see, if Congress passed a law that said anybody who's going to be in the federal civil service must be a Christian, now that would be unconstitutional under the provision that you just mentioned. And yet when a president nominates somebody to the federal courts, that's a purely political decision. And the checks are political, right? The Senate can reject the nominee of the Supreme Court. And even beyond that, if the President and the Supreme Court put somebody on the, if the President and the Senate put somebody on the Supreme Court that the voters don't like, we the people can vote against them. So in the realm that you're talking about, it's all a matter of raw political preference. The rule of law does not really ban the President from saying what he said. So that's the best I can do. That distinction between law and politics, at one level, you can't tell the difference. At another level, it is essential. It's essential, right? So that's what I would say about that. I share your concern, but that's in the realm of politics. And the remedy is the Senate can reject his nominees. We, the voters, can vote out the Senate and the President. Those are it's in the political realm, and the checks are political, not legal in the narrow sense. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Hi.
Yes, ma'am.
Instead of describing the symptoms, can you please share your insight on the political and social issues that led to the symptoms that we observed today?
Okay, I apologize. Could you repeat that, please? I didn't really get all the words.
Okay, instead of just discussing the symptoms that we observed today, can you share your insight on the social and political issues that led to these symptoms?
That led to?
To the symptoms that we are seeing today.
Symptoms.
Symptoms. Okay, all right. I think it's a combination of things, many of which cannot be measured precisely. You know, the issues. Well, I guess economic issues are front and center for a lot of people. I think race and gender and ethnicity issues are front and center for a lot of people. I'm not sure if this is getting to what you're talking about. I really think that Trump is president as a result of several things coming together at once. You know, and some people in here clearly would include the way that James Comey operated. Some people are sure that James Comey is who caused Hillary Clinton to be defeated. I suspect it was a factor. You know, but I think that the Russian hacking probably had an effect. Again, the dysfunctional electoral college is a problem. And Trump, you know, people say he's a genius or so. I can never use that term with respect to a guy like Trump, but he does have a knack for figuring out how to appeal to the worst in people. And that's always a problem since antiquity. That's a problem with demagogues. They have a way of appealing to the worst in people and as a result getting power. So you would have thought that the modern science of government, the modern science of politics talked about by Alexander Hamilton and other folks would have given us Republican institutions that could guard against that. But, you know, sometimes when several things come together at once, these are the kind of things that can happen. A lot of people are just freaked out about that and very depressed. In my line of work, I don't feel that I have that option. I have to pay attention and think about how do we get past this? How do we get past this? And so, I hope that answered part of your question. Okay, who's next, please? Yes, sir.
So, as non-religious people, I think we are probably very concerned about religious people having veto power over our civil rights or civil rights of people on that, for example, employment. I'm thinking in terms of, you know, right now there are there are no law against firing gay people because you don't like gay people, housing discrimination, and of course there's the, you know, public accommodation issues around, you know, for gays. There's no protection there.
I think in some states there are.
On a federal level.
Oh, at the federal level, no, that's
yeah.
right.
So yeah, in some states there were protections for blacks. When you know, so even back 50 years ago, there were some states that were in the states of the Confederacy, the old Confederacy, didn't protect black rights. So, I think for us, what do you think in terms of protection for civil rights that aren't vetoed by religious people in the name of religious freedom?
Okay. Like I say, at the state level, and I've not researched this, but I think in a lot of states there are protections against discrimination in employment and in housing based on sexual orientation, you know. Again, this is an aspect of our federal system, right, where we've got a national government, but we have state governments that can go their own way up to a point. And they can certainly, what states can do if they want is protect individual rights at a higher level than the minimum required by the national government and the U.S. Supreme Court. And so I think you see some states doing that. So one case that we're all thinking about these days is the ruling just this past week in the Masterpiece cake. Yeah. See, that case was brought under a Colorado state law banning discrimination in places of public accommodation based on sexual orientation. And there are other states that have laws like that as well. And so we're still kind of working out, you know, when that non-discrimination law comes into conflict with somebody's First Amendment claims, you know. This colleague that I work with at San Francisco State described this Masterpiece cake case as, you know, the baker shoehorning his religious claim into a free speech claim, right? Because ultimately he's claiming his religion, you know, his religious convictions are being violated, but you know, that doesn't really work so well, so he has to make it in terms of free speech. He's being forced to write, "Congratulations, Mike and Steve," on a cake.
No, that wasn't on the cake at all.
But they were asked to. My understanding of the facts of that case is that the baker had no problem selling a cake to a gay couple. It is preparing a wedding cake for their gay wedding that he had a problem with. And of course, as you know, he won. Now, it was a very narrow ruling, and these issues are going to keep coming up. But anyway, the general point is that there are protections in a number of states for gays. It's been a long time in coming. I'll give you that. But there are protections in a lot of states, I believe in California as well, in terms of employment and in terms of housing discrimination. So we muddle along. Yes, who's next? Yes, sir, what do you say?
You used the term white women as if it had a meaning.
Okay.
Fact is, it doesn't.
Is that right? Okay.
Our federal government agrees with you. They use that term. So does the Ku Klux Klan. A related term is African American, which is widely used. The fact is that all Americans are African Americans. We are all direct descendants of the Sapiens tribe, which was a black African tribe some time ago. Therefore, all Americans are African Americans. Yet we use that term as if it means something else. Total nonsense. Now, we can do something about it. And when I recently visited Cuba, I learned that they're way behind us technologically and financially, but they refuse to recognize this fake racial classification system. We haven't even defined it. If it's based on skin color, how dark do you have to be? Well, I happen to tan easily, and as a kid, I turned black every summer. And when I entered junior high, there was a graffiti saying, "Les Ernest is a nigger." Under the skin color criteria, I have changed races so far 150 times plus. So I suggest you back away from using the terms white or African American, and so should our society.
Okay. I don't disagree with what you just said, but I don't think it really speaks to the validity by using the term white, because I'm referencing something that is of undeniable significance to a lot of people. That's my point. In the public mind, in the mind of voters, I do think that there are a lot of people who do decide, in part, whether to vote for somebody based on their perception of that person's race. If you and I went around in here, I bet you and I could pretty much agree on who it is that society would generally consider to be a white woman and who would not. So I don't think that that term is meaningless. But in any case, I'm not disputing what you just said. I'm just saying that in terms of the public perception, white has significance. The African American has significance. It does. Well, all right, we'll have to agree to disagree on that one. I think I'm on strong ground in terms of how voters, some voters, look at people. And the category white or African American are not meaningless terms, at least at that level. Thank you. Yes?
All right, well, I think time's up for Q&A.
Oh.
That your conversation can continue at the speaker's table over there, and the buffet opens at 12:30. Let's give Martin a big hand.